All right, so I think it's 11:50. We can just go ahead and get started. Let me start my video here just to say hey to everybody. Can you guys see me? I can't tell.
For me, it's all black.
Oh.
Huh, that works better.
Okay, I can't actually see my own video, but that's okay. So hello everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Shereen Oraby. I'm an applied scientist at Amazon Alexa AI in Sunnyvale, California. And this is the NLG breakout session at SIGDIAL. Like I said, I'm at Amazon right now. Prior to that, I was doing my PhD at UC Santa Cruz with Marilyn Walker on stylistic control for NLG. And so this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've prepared some talking points. I think it's going to be easiest for me to take notes directly here on the speaker notes. And I'd like to be able to see the participant list and chat. So if you guys are okay, I will just keep it in this view instead of presenting so I can see everything. And with that, we can get started. Let me turn off my video here. And since we have a large number of attendees, it would be good if people could just introduce themselves as they begin to speak. So our first topic here, just kind of a general question for everybody, is NLG modeling. So things like what models are you interested in using? What kinds of tasks specifically have you worked on? And there are kind of some general ideas here like meaning to text generation or data to text generation, text to text generation, or other tasks that you've worked on. And feel free to kind of diverge from these topics, but we can kind of like keep it on the general topic of the slide. Does anybody have some kind of starting thoughts?
I can start. I guess like my use case is not, let me introduce myself, sorry. I'm Benham, I'm an applied scientist at Amazon Alexa as well. I guess for my tasks, it's more related to open domain dialogue and more focused on text-to-text response generation. So not exactly NLG, but similar-ish.
Are there any other, thanks Benham. So Benham mentioned response generation, which is a really hot topic. Benham, are you talking about, so you're talking about response generation in the context of dialogue, so your input is maybe a past utterance, and you want to generate the next appropriate utterance, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Does anybody have any other tasks that they have worked on, or even any thoughts about response generation or anything along those lines?
Hey, I'm Mike White from Ohio State and Facebook. I've done some work on NLG and task-oriented dialogue, among other things. So that's more meaning to text NLG. So maybe just to transition to your next bullet point there, one of the challenges is the pre-trained language models are never conditioned on the kinds of inputs that we see in task-oriented dialogue systems. And they're also very slow. So if you need to have a real-time response, that's a mismatch with the pre-trained language models.
Definitely. I think this is going to be kind of a really hot and maybe highly debatable topic. So we can move right into that. Massive pre-trained language models. I mean, we're getting larger and larger and larger models. And they're pretty astounding at what they can do, at least in my experience. Mike, can you maybe talk a little bit more about how you maybe overcame some of those challenges, things like model size and latency and different things like that?
No. we just submitted a paper on that, and I don't think I'm allowed to say
Okay.
until it's
Okay.
back from review.
Fair
But I wanted to call out those issues in case other people had things to say about them.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. It seems like a lot of the time, people in more like industrial settings are able to fine tune these models and host these models. And I'm interested to hear different perspectives on if you're in academia or if you're in industry. Are you able to kind of use really large models like GPT-2 and now GPT-3 and fine tune them? And what are the sorts of challenges you faced?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hey Shakib.
Hey, I'm Shakib. I'm a grad student at Carnegie Mellon University. And I have something to add here, and it's not really to do with the size and the training complexity, but more so with the other issue that Michael touched on, which is whether these transfer to task-oriented domains. And I kind of just want to raise the question of, does it, like intuitively, does it even make sense to take a model that was pre-trained on open domain dialogue and transfer it to like a task-oriented setting? So like what exactly are we hoping is going to transfer from training on Reddit to training to transferring to like ordering a pizza or something like that?
Right. What are your kind of thoughts about it? Have you tried? I think a lot of people are just hoping to get a better sense of language and grammar and structure. But you're right. I think there could be a lot of unintended transfer, and there could be a lot of just domain understanding that we don't get when we are training models on such different kinds of tasks or different domains. What is your experience, Shakib?
Yeah, my take on this is that very little transfers, and like I think that basically we're transferring the bare minimum, especially for language generation. And I think that like I don't know, maybe I'm not aware of work that people have done to like successfully transfer to task-oriented domains, but I really haven't seen anything too impressive with taking models like GPT-2 and transferring them to task-oriented domains.
So on this topic, what are people's experiences then with trying to fine tune these models for these specific tasks? I mean, Shakib, maybe you can comment, probably using like an off-the-shelf GPT for trying to do a domain task might not be so successful, but you might have better success if you fine-tuned it, if you were able to get the resources for that. Does Shakib or anybody have any comments about that?
I can maybe post in the chat. There's a couple recent papers, one from Microsoft and one from UCSB, where they both have few shot in the title, and they're that's a relative term, I would say, but they're able to deal with relatively little training data by fine tuning GPT-2. In the UCSB paper uses a copy model. The Microsoft paper uses a bunch of different domains and combines them together. So those are both at least somewhat successful in reducing the need for large amounts of domain-specific data, taking advantage of the pre-trained models. They don't deal with the slowness of those models, though. Right.
There's also, I mean, maybe this is one of the works you're mentioning, the Dialog GPT model that they fine-tuned. Is that one of the ones you're thinking about?
I'll look it up and post in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Any other thoughts here on pre-trained models? Have other people tried to use them for their tasks? Or what kinds of like models and architectures are people mostly working with? Okay, I will move on a little bit. So of course, all the rage are neural models. I'm going to assume that's what most people are using these days for NLG. I wonder, has anybody tried, for the sake of trying to get more perhaps accurate outputs, or to deal with issues like model latency, has anybody tried kind of working with like mixing neural and template-based models or other architectures? Let me move on from this topic a little bit. I'm not sure, is there anything else we want to kind of maybe cover from a modeling perspective before we move on? It's a little hard to gauge people's interest without seeing people, but I'll try to kind of have this flow a little bit. And if anybody just kind of wants to bring up something, please feel free to do that. These are just kind of talking points.
I have another question that just to raise to the group kind of, and it's kind of like, how much do people think, how much of the gains do you, sorry, let me just think about how to phrase this question. Is it more likely that we improve NLG and just like response generation by collecting more data or by improving models? Just curious to get people's thought on this.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about it from the response generation aspect. For me, I think it's uh, more about sort of like creating more clever data sets, like the Blender stuff that they did, where they incorporated empathy and knowledge and all these different components. At least from the open domain side, I think that makes sense. And then like from some work that we did was like incorporating like dialog acts into like a GPT model, and I think that helps sort of incorporate some sort of structure to the like response generation setting. And I think this is important because even though because like I mean, even though these models that are getting bigger and bigger, I think we see that even in models that are like Nina and Blender, like they're really big, but they still have like a lot of errors in terms of right, like factual inconsistency and stuff like that. So I think there needs to be like I guess like from the data set side, I guess like more like clever stuff with the data set, and then from the modeling perspective, not just making it bigger, but if there's some other components that we can add that tries to improve like things like factual consistency, like maybe paying attention more to the knowledge or something like that. Those are my thoughts.
Awesome, thanks, Venom. Kind of moving in, this is a kind of a good segue into our next slide here, more on NLG resources and data sets. Speaking to that, kind of what data sets are people using the most in their work? What are you guys finding the most useful and most accessible? Does anybody have any comments on their favorite data sets? lot of the recent work has used data sets like WebNLG, E2E, Wikibio. There are all sorts of data sets out there. Does anybody have any comment on what is kind of the most, maybe what they've worked with most recently?
Well, if no one else will, I'll put a plug in for our data set that we released with our ACL 19 paper. It's called Constrained Decoding for Task-Oriented Dialogue from Compositional Representations, or some such thing like that. So basically, one of the things that we were happy about was that we were pushing experimenting with including rhetorical relations in the inputs to a neural generator. So kind of a back to the future move that used to be considered, you know, that was kind of a central issue in natural language generation, was using coherence relations. And then people somehow seem to have forgotten about that when they started writing papers about neural methods. So that's a big data set, conversational weather, that has rhetorical relations in it.
Awesome.
It's publicly available. I'll post a link.
Oh, and can you maybe talk a little bit about how you collected the data? I mean, it's a tough thing.
So yeah, so that what we were focused on was kind of the neural response model. So we had a rule-based response generator. Basically, we used a crowdsourced collection of questions. So from simple things like what's the weather right now to, hey, do I need an umbrella tomorrow, and things like that. So there was a set of questions that were crowdsourced. Then we fed that, basically analyzed what kinds of questions they were, and together with a weather simulator, we fed that into a rule-based response planner. And then the output of the rule-based response planner together with the question was the basis of crowdsourcing, right? So we had crowd workers come up with, you know, according to guidelines, come up with ways to express the content, but respecting the rhetorical relations. So for example, if the content said if the question is what's the weather this weekend, the response might explicitly point out a contrast between it'll be sunny on Saturday, but there will be heavy rain on Sunday, or something like that. So contrasting different weather conditions, this fact that you were supposed to make that contrast was an explicit part of the input. So contrast and justification, like you won't need an umbrella because there'll be plenty of sunshine. So so there were only two rhetorical relations involved in that corpus, but it does require, you know, there may be a number of weather facts that you're reporting, and which ones are actually supposed to be contrasted is explicitly controlled in the input. You know, so future work might deal with the response planning component, for example, and looking at doing that other than a rule-based solution, but a much richer input to the neural generator.
Right. I think that's great, and this is this kind of work that tries to enforce like a semantic representation within the data sets. I think is really awesome, and it's something that we don't always see. There's a lot of work on like text-to-text generation where it's much harder for you to control semantics. I assume that, Michael, when you guys were designing that data set, this was one of your primary concerns, that you want to be able to have the semantics be very clear and kind of traceable if you're checking whether your generated output matches. Can you maybe speak to that a little?
Well, so I mean, in fact, I think you were involved in some of the work that inspired this, showing in the E2E challenge, right, with this restaurant recommendation. Mm-hmm. What you find is about, you know, there's no explicit indication that you should use rhetorical relations in your output, but people would choose to express contrast about 6% of the time. So they might say, it has French food, but it's not family friendly, right? So they were just asked to say that it has these two attributes, but they would choose to contrast them, making the assumption that it was bad that this restaurant was not family friendly, and that someone was presumably looking for that. Of course, that wasn't actually an explicit part of the data collection, and in in work that was done 15 years ago, there was a lot of work on user models where people were trying to actually model what people were looking for and what their general preferences were. And the system would choose to express contrast in terms of whether a particular restaurant, say, actually met what they were looking for or not, right?
Yes.
So while the E2E data set, the people would naturally make some assumptions in expressing contrast, you would really want to make your contrast sensitive to what your user was looking for, right? So it would not be coherent if what they were actually looking for was an adult-friendly establishment for a nice date night, to say it's French food but not family friendly. Actually, that would be good for them, right? So having a richer input to the system that's better tracking what people are really interested in would motivate more explicit control over the kinds of output you'd want to get from the generator. So that was why we actually also explored in the context of the E2E data set. Could you add more explicit control over contrast relations there, which were not that infrequent?
Definitely. And actually, just one quick follow-up to that. So in the restaurant domain, you mentioned things like it's maybe, it's family friendly, but it's very expensive, where there's kind of like a positive and a negative contrast there, and that maybe elicits that contrast relation that people decide naturally to specify. What kinds of things did you ask for in the weather domain that people would contrast? What would you ask people to contrast?
Yeah, I didn't write that part of the system. It was basically whether the so if it met what they were looking for, like if they're talking about wearing sunglasses or bringing an umbrella or something like that, if that met what they were looking for, or whether there was a change in the weather that would indicate a contrast. So certain conditions, so if there's just a change in what the cloud cover is, or certain things like cloud cover and precipitation could be in contrast, because if it's, there's implication relationships in there which are not explicitly modeled that you actually have to know about, right? So sunny implies either not cloudy or not raining or something like that. So it wasn't as simple as just saying any attribute whose value changes. We had to lay out some specific rules for what could be in contrast. So that's an interesting question. Not hard to do for a single domain in a rule-based system, but to do in a completely general way is an interesting challenge, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting actually to see what people maybe would have naturally tried to contrast in that domain, as opposed to what you guys specified, and maybe by analyzing that, we can figure out how to scale that to new domains, perhaps, if we want to do things like contrast or justify.
Sure, it's a great point.
Maybe moving on from here, does anybody want to comment on what their favorite NLG or even MT frameworks and tools are to use? There's lots of different frameworks and tools that people use. I think some are more popular than others. Does anybody want to give us some insight into what they've used for their recent projects? Maybe some thoughts about things like starting from like a generic framework like PyTorch or TensorFlow, as opposed to using something that is maybe specifically designed for NLG, something maybe like OpenNMT or newer frameworks. Has anybody tried kind of both? And do you guys have any thoughts about that? I'll move on from this question here. I'll move into evaluation. This is kind of a highly debated topic in NLG. There's been lots of interesting papers kind of calling out the fact that we need new evaluation metrics, notably the paper from Novikova a couple of years ago. And the fact that, you know, right now to get a paper accepted, you have to do a human evaluation. I think that's now a standard thing for NLG, which is great. But there's always this question of what kinds of questions should I ask? How many annotators should I use? How do I ensure agreement? And I think these are really important and kind of controversial maybe issues, because there's things like, do I have enough resources? Annotation is expensive. Do I do it in-house or do I outsource it on a crowdsourcing platform? And I wonder if anybody has any comments about human evaluation or automatic evaluation methods and what they try to do as a standard for their work.
I can comment a little bit about this. So over the past few months, I've been doing a lot of work on evaluation, and I'm actually presenting a paper tomorrow, I believe, during the evaluation session. But basically what we did was we took a couple of these, we took outputs from the Mina paper. So basically just dialogues where Mina's interacting with a human, and then they also had human-human dialogues collected in the same context, and dialogues with another system. And we annotated these for 18 different qualities. So things like fluency, naturalness, but like as many different qualities as we could find in the literature. And we found in our paper, we identify which one of those qualities were perceived as most important by the annotators. And we also came up with an automatic metric. But on the topic of automatic metrics, what I wanted to say was that I think that people have largely accepted, or I mean, I don't know whether I can say that, but at least to me, it seems like people have accepted that in dialogue, you can't compare to a reference response. So instead, what we proposed doing was basically just using model-based evaluation. And I think that for automatic metrics for dialogue and NLG, that should be what people should be doing, rather than word overlap metrics.
Definitely. Can you actually talk a little bit about, now not to talk too much about your paper to be presented tomorrow, and it'd be great if you could tell us the name and the session so people can attend.
Yes.
But can you talk a little bit more on what you mean by model-based metrics in general here?
Right. Yeah. So the name of my paper is Unsupervised Evaluation of Interactive Dialogue with Dialogue GPT, and it is in the session 9, I believe. But by model-based metrics, basically what I mean is rather than metrics that take as input a generated response and a reference response and attempt to compute the similarity in some way, and that both includes word overlap metrics and embedding-based metrics. I basically think that that is not a reasonable thing to be doing for dialogue evaluation, just because the space of valid responses is way more than what exists in your test set. What instead I think people should be doing is training models that will take as input a dialogue context and a response, and then output some notion of how good it is, or how fluent it is, or how natural it is. And this is really tricky to do, just because you either need to collect a data set or you need to find a way to do this without supervision. But I think that for automatic metrics, this is the way to go, because correlation with human judgment is really bad if you're just using something off the shelf like BlueScore.
So inherently, to be able to do this, there's kind of another step that comes before it, where you have to be able to perhaps collect a data set that you feel represents good enough outputs that you can use to then train this model that can tell you whether something is fluent, right? How do you solve that initial problem?
Yeah, that's tough. the solutions that I was working on was stuff where you didn't have to collect this data set of quality annotations, and you could do it without supervision. So I'm not too sure about how to do that, but I think like my opinion is that the responsibility of releasing an automatic metric that works well for a data set falls on the developers of a data set. So like if you collect a data set, it's your responsibility to define an evaluation metric that has good correlation with human judgments on your data set.
That's a great point. I think that's a great, I think that's really hard for people to do, and especially because the burden of even collecting a data set is so difficult. It's you know, a whole nother problem to define the evaluation metrics. But I feel like you're absolutely right. The authors are the people that are most kind of intimately aware of what the idiosyncrasies of their data sets are, and would be the right people to talk about how to evaluate. I think that's a great idea. You mentioned kind of veering away from reference-based metrics, which I think is a really clear point, and also embedding-based metrics, which are getting kind of more and more popular. I mean, we're seeing things coming out like BERT score and more recently Fluor. I wonder, do you feel they're at least a step up from purely lexical overlap metrics, or do you feel like it's just more of the same?
Well, so I have a paper at ACL where we compared a bunch of different metrics on the persona chat dataset and the topical chat corpus. And we found that BERT score does better than a lot of other things, but it still does not do very well. And I think like even some metrics, I think Meteor did better than BERT score, which like goes to show that it's really not too much better, at least for dialogue.
Okay, okay. Interesting to know. It's interesting because, I mean, you see papers on, when you release a metric, you'll see papers saying how much better they are on some particular data set. And it's just, it's obviously it's not possible for everyone to evaluate on all data sets, right? Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to see maybe people can also present data sets that those metrics don't correlate very well with human evaluation on. And maybe that would be kind of more enlightening for people.
Yeah, I think like the thing with BERT score, the way I see it, is that it's really good at capturing a certain type of error, which is like it generates something that is semantically similar but not exact. But in dialogue, it's possible to generate a response that is semantically different entirely, like does not even mean the same thing, but it's still a valid thing to say. Oh, and one thing I should add here is when I'm talking about, like, I guess like my mind, when I was thinking about evaluation, just went to open domain response generation evaluation. But like this might be like, the whole problem might be entirely different for task oriented or for like meaning to text representation. So I don't know whether the same problems exist in task oriented dialogue or like meaning to text generation.
I can comment briefly on this. So coming from a more meaning to text or data to text generation background, I think we're still in the boat of automatic metrics, blue, meteor, reference-based metrics. And I think in the case of data to text, embedding-based metrics are a step up. But you're right. I mean, there's a huge constellation of ways people can express things, and that's not just in the context of dialogue generation, but even if you're trying to express just something from a simple meaning representation, there's an infinite number of ways you could do it. And even going back to Michael's point earlier, I mean, you could do a contrast, you could do a justify, depending on the types of variables you're trying to realize. And I think my background also comes from kind of a strong interest in stylistic variation. And a lot of the time, we're trying to come up with metrics that allow us to generate outputs that contain high stylistic variation and not get penalized on automatic metrics. So it's tricky, and that means that we have to do human evaluation all the time. and not necessarily trust automatic metrics, or kind of use them just for very bare benchmarking, or trying to control semantic accuracy or compute it. But I think, yeah, the problem gets worse and worse as you have less constraint on what the output should actually be. So in the case of dialogue response generation, as you said.
I wanted to make a comment more on human evaluation. I think the automatic metrics, like, totally agree with what everyone said, and I mean, it's going to be super useful. I guess, like, my question is on, like, and this is more towards everyone. So like there's this approach where people, like Shikib annotated 18 different qualities. People annotate like different sort of aspects. I mean, this is more question to everyone. Like, should there be a lot of different aspects that people should evaluate with, or should it be like a small number? Like, can we group them into like 4 or 5 things? I mean, from the literature, I think people are basically, they want to evaluate the same exact thing, but they're just saying in a different way. So, I mean, like, I think it should be grouped into sort of like one definition, but it'd be great to hear what other people think.
I have a comment on that, if possible. This is more from a human dialogue point of view, that if the point of creating a dialogue system of any description is to work with human affordances, in other words, to make the text or speech more understandable in human dialogue, the metrics, particularly the human annotation metrics, should take account of this. I've become quite worried over the last while reading a lot of the newer papers on, let's say, the neural systems, on a sort of a folk pragmatics that seems to be growing, that in dialogue, repetition is bad. Repetition is a major feature of most dialogue between humans, because we're working with, we're relying on working memory on a signal that is very, very evanescent. If it's speech, it's gone. We can't read back. And I'm beginning to see a lot of these features which are being used to evaluate being based on the idea that people would read the dialogue. And natural dialogue does not make for good literature. As anybody who's ever read a conversation script, a CA script, it's full of simple language, it's full of repetition, and these have a purpose. They help the dialogue work. So it's just a sort of a, I suppose it's a bit of a whinge in a way, that I think that there's a need to go right back, if you're talking about human evaluation, and see what humans are exactly evaluating. Because if they're evaluating it in some way based on some maybe not stated rubric of how good literature should be, we're not really evaluating dialogue.
I think that's an awesome point. I wonder if, kind of going back to what Benham was saying, if in that case we can sort of design metrics that are grouped even based on different use cases. So if you wanted to generate text that was more appropriate for literature or reading, as opposed to if you were generating text that was appropriate for like a personal assistant to be saying, we probably need different metrics that penalize and promote different things, right? And that makes the problem more complex, but I feel like that's really, really important. Even things like disfluencies could be interesting to hear, but you could never have them if you were generating text for some written domain, right?
Well, you can. People are writing them into text conversations now. I mean, you've probably written it in on Skype. You know, you've written in or hang on or wait a second.
Right.
And not to mention the bouncing dots to show I'm thinking, I'm hesitating.
Or emoji generation, right, to go further.
If I could add to that, I think a very related point that most people seem to have forgotten is that what we would really prefer to be doing is extrinsic evaluation and not intrinsic evaluation, right? So intrinsic is this grammatical, is this natural, you know, just evaluating this really out of the context of what it really is supposed to be doing. Whereas extrinsic is basically about effectiveness. I mean, can we remember the content? Are we influenced by the content? Are we engaged with the content? Would we want to work with the system again, or are we turned off by it, right? So ultimately, we would like NLP systems to make choices that actually lead to things that people can understand, remember, enjoy, you know, whatever the real goal of the whole dialogue system is, right? So it's obviously much harder to evaluate things extrinsically than intrinsically. So that's why people always just do intrinsic evaluations, because it's, in some sense, they just think it's too hard. But it has been done before. There's been papers with very good extrinsic evaluation in the history of NLG. And if people want to take on something challenging, they should take that on.
Definitely. I think that's a great point. And it is something that people maybe find really difficult and decide not to do. But I think that's a really important point, especially since a lot of us are working in kind of NLG application, dialogue system kind of settings. With that, I'll actually move into NLG applications as our next topic. What kinds of real world applications have people used NLG models for, or how do you kind of contextualize your response generation or your data to text generation? And what kind of considerations do we need to make when doing NLG in the wild? Does anybody have any comment on that?
I guess I got a small comment. Again, like this is not really related to task-oriented stuff, but the open domain stuff. But when we've been trying to productionalize like our response generation models, I mean, one big thing was latency, of course. I mean, that's something that everyone has to deal with. And I mean, users may get frustrated, of course, if the model takes a very long time. So I think the point that Michael made about extrinsic evaluation is important because like user frustration can come into that aspect if the model is taking too long. So sometimes we have to do a trade-off between using a maybe a smaller model, but it's much faster, even if it's performs a little bit less than a larger model.
Totally agree. And it would be interesting to see kind of like breakdowns of what kind of like, in terms of evaluation, what is the penalty of using a smaller model as opposed to the extrinsic evaluations, like is it still acceptable to users, even though you're using smaller models or you're using kind of less complex models. I don't know if there's been any kind of explicit work doing that, but I think that would be interesting to see just from a productionization kind of perspective. Were there any other comments around this point? Integration into dialogue systems or other kind of related topics here?
You probably want to avoid generating hate speech if you want to keep your advertisers.
Yes, absolutely. Which leads us into bias in NLG. Model biases in general, especially in the world of massive pre-trained models that are trained on all kinds of data and who knows what's in there. There's been recent work on kind of trying to even induce bias and understand what kinds of biases exist in these massive pre-trained models. Has anybody actually actively observed any biases in their models and would like to comment or have any thoughts about this in general? I mean, there's even like kind of a smaller scale versions of this where it's not necessarily like you're generating racist or kind of derogatory remarks, but even small things like a pre-trained model deciding to generate output about a particular location or using someone's name or something like that, you can start to see how if you prime the model with particular inputs, you will induce particular outputs based on what the model has been trained on. And I think this is a really hard topic, and it leads into kind of ethics. And I think we as a community need to be really mindful of this, and at least aware of what kinds of biases are inherently in these models. I don't know if anybody has kind of had any explicit experience with any of this.
I guess I can quickly add something. It didn't personally happen to me, but this Alexa Prize competition that I don't know if people have heard of, but we have teams like all over the world, like Europe and whatnot. And sometimes the teams that are outside the US have problems where they sort of generate a response which might not work in the United States because of the culture. So the exact example was they said like Santa Claus wasn't real. And I guess that upsets a lot of the users because they don't want that. They don't want things like that to be said. So I guess how does sort of culture, how to incorporate like different cultures into your system such that it's more mindful of what it's saying. So not necessarily just hate speech, like sort of not necessarily just hate speech, but it could be something that's like a normal utterance, but it could just be offensive to someone just because of the culture they live in. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting example, actually. That would be hard to figure out that was kind of a bias in any automatic way, right? So that's really tricky. That's all the questions I prepared. I wonder if, I mean, we're wrapping up here, we're past the 45-minute mark, but I wonder if anybody has any kind of other comments they'd like to share or any closing thoughts. This has been really interesting so far. Would anybody like to make any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. Hi, I'm Stefan, Ultis from Mercedes-Benz.
Hey.
I was thinking about all the comments made about evaluating energy in the context of some type of dialogue. And it seems to me that most of the problems are exactly the same than evaluating dialogue systems themselves. So there you also have the same problems. You cannot just look at single responses, and you need to take the context into account of a given response and all these things. So I feel like what we've discussed about evaluating energy systems is basically what we need to discuss about evaluating the whole dialogue interaction.
I think that's a great point. A lot of the time I feel like it's because it's just more difficult, right? Have you actually had any experience where you were able to do kind of full dialogue evaluation? And if so, can you tell us maybe how or how you set that up?
Well, not necessarily on the text level, where the systems I was working with were usually using a template-based generator or something similar to that. So it was not really, so the NLG part was really weak, let's say.
That's fine.
But I mean, of course, I mean, things you do in the task-oriented world is looking at task success and these things. But I really wonder how the actual language that we use in those systems actually influence those measures.
Definitely. What kind of dialogue level metrics did you use?
Well, the standard one was task success, of course. But I was also working on user satisfaction based metric called interaction quality. Yes,
Yeah.
things like that. But I mean, it's more on a dialogue level, and it's really hard to break this then down to the generated language for single turns.
Definitely, definitely. Maybe some kind of a combinational thing where
Yes.
You evaluate single turns, but you also have a full dialogue-based metric so that you can actually tell if you're hitting the right goals and if you're doing the right thing, right? And I think this goes back a little bit to the extrinsic metric kind of goal that Michael was discussing earlier. Thanks, Stefan. Is there any other thoughts that people wanted to share?
But I guess related to that, I mean, it's not too hard to run a evaluation where you just swap in a baseline generator versus your generator that you actually think improves some of these metrics, and then you see whether you can get an effect, right? Can you improve task success, user satisfaction, interaction quality, whatever it is you're measuring for your whole system? So there's definitely potential synergy there. And I think an underexplored thing is, you know, there's a whole set of people who call themselves conversation designers who you know, at least have a lot of anecdotal experience about what ways of saying things are actually effective in the context of dialogue systems, and how to make use of their insights with something other than templates is kind of an open question, right? So can you make use of conversation designers in developing a better model-based solution? I think it's a hard question.
That's a great point. Did you have anything to add there, Stefan?
No. I thought I was, but I'm not.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, and this kind of also goes back to just trying to understand who we're generating for and what kinds of systems we're operating on, because I mean, it's going to make a difference what your setup is and how you evaluate your task. And I think that's a really good point, that we can rely on people that are more experienced with what these dialogues maybe should look like, and ask them maybe perhaps what kind of metrics might be the correct things to ask. Any other comments before we wrap up here?
Yeah, maybe I would like to add something after all. So I agree that it might not be hard to just replace the NLG part with another one and just see what the effect is. But for me, the main question is, how can you make use of this metric to actually train your generator to do better generation based on the task at hand? Maybe task-oriented systems or anything else, it doesn't matter. I think that's a real question. Because I mean, of course, you can just evaluate stuff, but the question is, how can you kind of tune your generator towards really improving those metrics, not having any side effects with it, and not just because you have a more diverse energy, not just having the same template all over again. That already improves your scores and these things. So for me, that's the hard question.
Definitely, I think it's an open question. I think we're right at time here. If nobody has any additional comments, I will actually save the chat here. People have been posting great links to papers and other work. We have our notes here in the comments. If anybody wants to add anything, the link is open. It's on the Trello. Thanks so much to everybody that joined. This is really interesting. I'm glad to see you guys and get to talk about these kinds of issues together. Thanks, everybody. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks.